Hey everyone, welcome to the Community Macros project. I hope to spend just a little bit of time just kind of taking you through the project, showing you how to add and edit a macro, and hopefully it'll address some of those burning questions you have about what to do with this particular project. This particular project is more of a secondary priority. Our first priority is always to address questions and tickets in the queue for our students. So one of the expectations before managing this project is to be sure that you as an RC member address any new tickets in Zendesk that are over 24 hours old or are approaching 24 hours old before tackling this project. This is especially important during our busy season, typically between July and October. Probably not going to be much of an issue though when things start to slow down for the remainder of the year. Um, so, after that's been taken care of and you want to jump in and add or edit a macro, what you'll want to do is access the Community Macro Best Practices document as your guide. There's a lot of great information in this particular resource, and you can find that right here in the resources section of the Community Macros project. For starters, any RC member should aim to have the same voice when creating or editing a macro. That's extremely important so that we can keep that macro friendly, concise, but generic at the same time. Um, if you have a chance, go ahead and read through some of our existing macros to get a better understanding of the writing style. Typically, when we create macros, we want to try and keep it generic. We'll only create placeholders for things within a macro if it's absolutely necessary and it makes sense. And what do I mean by a placeholder? Something within curly brackets that says insert this here. Um, the goal is to create a macro that is generic enough to whereby you can add some niceties, but if we were to have an oops moment with one of our newer members and they accidentally were to send the email off prematurely, it would still be a complete email that didn't need very much editing. So um, just kind of keep that in mind. We create macros for the most common questions and messages we receive from our students. That means that not every single thing that comes into the Community Macros project necessarily warrants an actual macro to be created. There really does need to be kind of, we definitely need to see a need for that particular macro, mainly questions that are coming in consistently from students and so on and so forth. So, and there's always a downside to having too many macros. So just kind of keep that in mind. There are definitely a lot more. There are quite a few more things to consider when creating a macro. So in that case, I do again suggest that you take a look at our Community Macro Best Practices document. It will list all of those things in the first page, things to consider. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through what it looks like to jump into a macro from start to finish. I'll show you quickly what you'd need to do to edit and then also to add a macro. So let's start off with editing an actual macro since that's easier. When you edit a macro, you're always going to jump into Zendesk to have that taken care of. You're going to need to have administrative access in Zendesk. So if you don't have that already, I suggest that you reach out to either myself or Brianna to make sure that you have the right access needed. Once you have administrative access, you can go ahead to this settings wheel or this admin wheel on the far left side, and from that you would access macros and it would open up this page and you can either add or edit a macro. So let's, for example, very briefly talk about what you'd need to do if you were editing a macro. Whatever macro it is you're looking for, you'd either search for the actual macro if you know the title, and if you know the title, type it in, it should automatically come up. I'm just going to go ahead and access the first macro that we see here in the list. If you'd like to edit that macro, just go ahead over to the far right side, click on this ellipse, and you will be given an option to edit the macro itself. Okay, I'm going to talk a little more about the actual actions and stuff later on when we're adding a macro, but for now, let's just go ahead and take a look at the actual body of the macro itself. This one happens to be a liquid macro, and I'm going to talk a little more about liquid macros in a separate video. But for all intents and purposes here, all you'd have to do is just throw your cursor in wherever it is you need to make the edit, and then you can go ahead and do that. Some of our macros have been grandfathered, our old macros have been grandfathered into the new Zendesk version, and so you're going to click on that link there where it says edit in rich text formatting, and so that way you can actually add links or add hot links right within the body. What you're looking at here is some older syntax in order to create a link, for example. Way back when we had macros under Zendesk 1.0, you'd have your text, and whatever it was you needed hyperlinked, you would have to put it in straight brackets, and then right after the straight brackets put parentheses around the actual link itself. And then when you would go to view the macro, so let's see, and then once you would go to, whoops, didn't want to do that. If you wanted to test the macro out, I would just, for example, open up a new window within Zendesk, and we can just search for that macro. Take all this out. So let's say we wanted to look at that. Oh, that's right. It is a liquid macro, so I'm not going to use that as an example. But just believe me when I say that when you switch over and test your macro out and call it up, then the actual text, which was shown here, would simply show up as live and hyperlinked right down here. This is what we were looking at before. So anyhow, any edits that you need to have made can just be done directly here. When you need to save, just scroll down to the bottom, save your actual edit, and you are all done. So edits are fairly simple. Another thing you can do within a macro is to clone the macro. So for example, if you wanted to create a suite of macros, for example, right here, rather than reinvent the wheel, you can just click on clone, and that way it will make a copy, and then you can just make your changes to the title, to the body, modify whatever it is you need, and you've just saved yourself some time rather than creating a completely new macro. So keep that in mind. That's always very helpful when managing this project to save on time. I'm going to switch back over to the actual project itself, and we are going to dive into adding a macro. I'm going to use the very first macro up top, and we are going to add this one together, and you can watch what I do. Before I do that, let me just talk a little bit about the project itself and how it's organized. Okay, so the most common, a list of the most common community categories that we have for macros are fivefold. So product, admin, pre-purchase, miscellaneous, and study help. We don't do too many of these. A lot of times our content team will take care of those. And so the first four will probably be the ones you dive into the most. But those are the 5 community categories, and you've probably seen those in the actual list of macros when you've called them up in the past. So that's how we kind of manage this project. Now, when a new task comes in for a macro, it will be generically added toward the top. So the first one the one we're going to look at today is listed as, what if I had 2 prepaid Visa cards I want to use? That's going to be a great one to throw into admin. I'm probably going to create this as an admin macro. So assuming that all of these have been categorized and we know exactly where they're going to go, once we're ready to start creating this new macro, right, by the word add here, we're going to take a look at the text within, we're going to take a look at the actual Asana task, and that text from the macro should be in there in the description. The ticket is going to be linked so you can reference that when you're creating the macro. And then the the internal ticket, whereby we would actually make a suggestion to add a macro. All that information will be listed here, right? So the suggested macro offers a macro title of, purchase Magoosh with multiple Visa gift cards. It offers an explanation of the issue from the person who had submitted the request to have the macro created, and then it'll also list the text from the actual email itself. Every single time I will actually just kind of give myself a general overview of the ticket itself so I can understand why the macro is being requested. It's always important to go in with a second pair of eyes to make sure that this particular macro is definitely needed. This happens to be one that I had suggested. I've seen this question come up multiple times in the past, and I foresee that this question will continue to come through, and so this makes sense to add into our suite of macros. So how do we do that? Well, the best thing to do is to have the Community Macros Best Practices document available. There's going to be a lot of stuff to reference when creating this particular macro. So having that document open is going to be helpful. Obviously, being able to jump into the macro section of Zendesk is where I want to go. And we're going to add a new macro because I know this macro does not exist quite yet. Okay, so what are the required fields? What do we need to add for this new macro? Well, the first thing we need to do is create a title. And according to our best practices document, the format of the macro title should be this. We should have a category, a type, if that makes sense. This is more of an option, but for sure we have to have a category, and we have to have a specific situation, exam, or something that lists a specific situation. Okay, so here would be an example. These are full macro title examples. Admin discount, okay, $49 for existing GRE as an example. So let's go over back into Zendesk. I know this is going to be admin, okay, and this has a very specific syntax for the title. So no spaces in between. If you take a look, the only capitalization in the title is going to be the very first word in our category. Everything else remains lowercase unless we're talking about an exam itself or a proper noun, and so everything else again will be not capitalized. So just keep that in mind. So for admin, let's see. I am choosing not to put in a specific type of macro. I don't think it warrants that specific detail, but I am going to throw in the more specific title here, purchase Magoosh with multiple Visa gift cards. And I'm going to just change that a bit here. Okay, purchase Magoosh with multiple Visa gift cards. In fact, I probably can shorten this. We don't have to talk about purchasing Magoosh. Of course they're going to purchase Magoosh. Okay, so we'll just say purchase with multiple Visa gift cards. That should be short, concise, and still gets to the point. Description is optional. We don't enter in a description. We make sure that this is available for all agents. Now, you are new to creating macros, and perhaps you don't want everyone to see the macro as you're creating it. As you get better and better with this, it won't be an issue, and you'll select all agents. But for you starting off, if you don't feel comfortable with that, you can just select me only. You will be the only person who can view the macro, and that way you're making it private. If you want to make it public, then you just go ahead and switch it over to all agents, and then anyone can access that from our suite of macros. Okay, let's talk a little bit about actions. So what exactly do we need to do? So one of the very first actions that we're going to need is going to be status. And so it really all depends, right? You're going to want to go back to that particular scenario and just read that ticket. So let's go over here. And I'm just going to read straight from the Asana task. Here, happy to help. If you have a PayPal account, prepaid Visa cards can be added to it. Okay, so this seems pretty cut and dry. Whenever something is pretty cut and dry, it has a very succinct solution, we know exactly there really won't be much follow-up from the student, you're going to select solve. If it's more of an open-ended question, or you foresee that a student can reply back with, really more questions, then go ahead and choose pending. So typically it's between these two. In this case, this is a very easy solution. We're just going to mark that as solved. The next action you're going to add is assignee. You'll always select current user, which is yourself, or whomever is working on the ticket. And then the next one is going to be add tags. By default, all macros are going to have the tag macro. Okay, and then if you are working on something very specific, like a specific GRE test, or if it was if it were something else that were very specific and it made sense to add a tag, then you would go on ahead and do that. If you go to the Community Macros Best Practices document, we have it actually linked for you. For example, here, if you click on this particular link, you will there's a more comprehensive list of tags to know. So when you're tagging future macros, you have an idea, okay, well, it makes good sense to add, X tag into this particular macro. In this case, the only thing that I would want to add is just that default macro action, or add that particular tag for that action. Okay, and the fourth thing that you're going to add, and the last one that you're going to add, is going to be the comment or description. Very obvious. We're going to want to actually have a response back to this student. To start the actual body, we're going to, I go right back to the best practices document and I reference a very specific line right here. This is our actual greeting. This is a liquid macro greeting. And very simply, it states that if the particular student has a first name written in the first name field in Zendesk, then it will call that first name and you don't have to type the student's name in. If a student has put in a series of numbers for a first name, or if their name is all caps or doesn't, I'm sorry, forgive me, if it's just a series of numbers, or it has some sort of punctuation, or just something that isn't, alpha character oriented, then it's just going to say hi there. So there you go. There's the quick and dirty on what this long string of intimidating text looks like and means. Okay, so there you go. That's the start of an actual macro. Very simple. And while we're here, I can just grab the ending too. Put that in, and then I can just throw in a couple of spaces and start adding the information. Now, very simply, I can just return back to the ticket. And I can very likely grab it, right? So the reason why I wanted to go back to this particular ticket is when I had read it, I knew that there was an active link, and so with that, instead of copying that, so that link didn't carry over from Zendesk into Asana. So in this case, I'm going to do it here, okay? All right, we'll jump back over. Okay, reformat that. Okay, and everything looks good. The next thing you're going to want to do is test your macro out to make sure that everything's in working order. So go ahead and click on the Add tab at the top. Great. And then call the macro up at the bottom directly from Zendesk. Don't do it from Digital Genius because Digital Genius hasn't had a chance to sync up with Zendesk so that your macro is recognized or any changes you've made to your macro has been recognized. It takes some time. I'm not sure what that time is, but you're most likely going to be testing it immediately after you've made your changes. So you're going to want to do it here. So purchase width, there it is. Okay. And as you can see, everything is looking to be in working order. Formatting looks good. You'll want to test out any links that are there to make sure they're going in the right spot. So in this case, I wanted it to go directly to PayPal to let the student know what to do. So this looks great. Now at this point, we're going to jump back to the Community Macro project and we're just going to do a little bit of housekeeping to make sure that everything has been taken care of. So the macro that we were taking care of was under admin. And once you have completed the actual macro, what you're going to want to do is, and I've already taken care of it here, you're going to want to copy and paste the title of the macro from Zendesk and post it in a comment. A lot of times I'll bold it to make it obvious that this was taken care of, and anyone who comes in and checks out the macro will see that this is the exact macro title that was created for this particular task. So there are a few other things that we want to do before we consider it as completed. One thing to do I'm sorry, I neglected to mention this earlier. If you're in the middle of working on a macro, you're going to want to assign it to yourself. That way, between you and your partner, you will know what your partner is working on versus what someone else is working on. If you happen to be working on a macro on a Friday and you're doing some research, you haven't gotten all the information that you've needed to complete it, it will be your responsibility to finish that macro out even though it's not your rotation. So we want you to complete a macro from start to finish. Probably the only exception would be if it's an unusually large project and we want multiple people working in on it at once, for example, maybe a macro audit. But in this case, since it's just a one-off macro, we want you to take ownership of it from start to finish. So when you do that, go ahead at the beginning and assign it to yourself. I'm doing that now. And now we've already completed this. We want to actually we don't want to mark it as complete quite yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set that due date out about 2 weeks. This is an add-on to the current video. So in this case, it was already scheduled out to the 16th, so I'm going to keep with that. We had some technical issues with the tail end of this video, so I'm re-recording right now. So we're going to say the 16th, but just so that you know, usually 2 weeks out is what we want to do. Now, in a perfect world, we would have remote community members checking this project all the time to see what kind of completed macros there are, but that's not really the case. So what we want to do to increase visibility is to also add a tag so that it's a notification is sent out to have it added to our newsletter. That way it just gets more visibility and people know that this has been created. So in that case, you'll add this tag, RC Weekly Digest, and that'll take care of things as well. And then finally, don't mark it as complete quite yet. Again, it's assigned to you and you've set a due date. So what you're going to do is click and drag it down to completed macros, and then you'll be prompted later on 2 weeks from now to go ahead and mark it as complete. So that'll be on your radar and that'll be your responsibility once that's been taken care of. If in fact you needed to look up a completed macro in the community macro project, you can just click over here on change view and go from incomplete tasks to completed tasks. And all of our completed tasks for this project would be listed here, and you can do a quick search at the top. For example, if you were looking for evaluate TOEFL speaking, clearly my spelling isn't working today. And there it is. So evaluate TOEFL speaking. Um, then you can go ahead and, reference that, whatever you need to do with it. But just know that completed tasks are listed there. Otherwise, we'll go back to our incompleted tasks. Okay, so looks like we have added just about everything. Let's see if I have any other notes to include. Um, Oh, yes. And one last thing I want to mention is, how does a macro get into Asana in the first place? I mean, how are we looking at all of these? Are we manually adding them? Um, Actually, it starts in Zendesk. So to answer that question, most people who, for example, let's just grab a ticket. Let's say I'm running through a ticket and one is awesome and I want to make sure that a macro comes out of it, and I'm just picking one at random. In that case, what we're going to do is actually call up a macro, okay, and it's called macro improvement. When I add macro improvement, it's going to put it as an internal note, or default to as an internal note. It's going to add this tag. This tag, RC macro, becomes a trigger to then send the macro suggestion over to Asana. So it will show up at the very top right over here. And again, you're going to go in and you're going to change all this information. Here's a reminder to change the title of the ticket. So if you're in the middle of responding to this student, you're not going to want to change that ticket title quite yet, because that might confuse the student. They won't understand that you are in the process of suggesting it as a macro. So wait until an actual ticket's been taken care of, and then you can go ahead and add all the different pieces to this particular suggestion, so that it sends it over to community macros. And then when that's done, you can go ahead and take that suggestion and categorize it under one of these 5, and you're all set until that particular person for the week sees the suggested macro and starts to work on it. Again, just as a reminder, not all all macro suggestions become macros. We have to be discerning. If there's something that is very similar, perhaps the better suggestion would be to make it a super macro, or perhaps it's just a little too redundant and you say, no, I don't think we're going to add that. If you have any questions about this process, or if the macro should be created to begin with, you are very welcome to contact myself, Sarah Seward, on Slack, or directly via email at sarah.magoosh@gmail.com. Reach out to your partner as well. They would have some experience with this as well, and can help you understand whether or not something should be done. Yeah, so happy macro creating, and we'll see you on Slack. Thanks.